Welcome to Mage Wars. I'm Alan Gerding, and today we're going to talk about spellcasting. Specifically, we're going to look at the parts of the spell cards, dissect each little segment, and we're going to talk about the steps involved in the actual spellcasting. Let's get started. Ultimately, a battle between mages is a battle between spells. Each mage is defined by the type of spells that they have. Mages have a book full of spells. In these books are the spell cards, because spells in Mage Wars are represented by cards. Let's take a look at one now. The first thing you'll see is the spell name. In our example, we're going to use the Evade spell. The next most important piece of information is the spell type. Whether that's an incantation, attack, creature, conjuration, equipment, or enchantment, each spell type has a few differences that affect how you'll play them. In our Evade spell example, it is an incantation. You can tell because it says incantation in the upper right, but it also has the purple border. The borders and the colors indicate what kind of spell type it is for quick reference. Some spells or abilities can only affect or target particular spell subtypes. This could be anything from the race of a creature to the style of an enchantment. In our example of Evade, the spell subtype is Command. After that, we have the casting line that shows the information you need to cast a spell, including the casting cost, action, range, and target. This is what you're going to look at most of the time when you're planning on casting a spell. The casting cost is how much mana you spend to cast the spell. And in our example of Evade, the casting cost is 3. It's indicated with that big 3 in the purple circle. The action icon tells the type of action required to cast a spell. Quick spells are simple and can be cast while moving, requiring a quick action, but full spells are complex, so you must remain stationary, and that requires a full action. Just imagine a mage requiring a whole bunch of concentration. That's going to be a full action spell. This icon shows what kind of action you must spend to cast a spell, quick action or full action. In our example, it is a quick action icon. You can tell because it's a lightning bolt with the yellow background in that circle. You may only cast a spell at a target that is in range. Range is always listed as a minimum and a maximum. So even if the range is 0, it's still going to say 0-0. If the target is too close or too far away, you cannot cast a spell. So in our example of Evade, the range is 0-2, meaning when you cast a spell, it can be in the same zone as the caster, the mage usually, or it can be up to 2 zones away. Also, every spell must be cast at a target. You may select the target only if it matches the requirements listed on the spell you are casting. Some spells may target objects with particular traits or subtypes, but in our example of Evade, it specifically focuses and targets upon corporeal creature, and you can see that right there. So this section of the spell card describes what the spell does when you cast it, what effect it has on the game. If the spell has any upkeep costs, they're described here. And in our example, obviously, it says target gains the elusive trait until the end of the round. And that's the effect of the Evade spell. You cast this so that the target, which will be a corporeal creature within 0-2 of a range, with a cost of 3, will have an elusive trait. So that's pretty powerful. The last piece of information is the spell school and level. This information is used when you choose spells to include in your spell book. Spell book is something done in between games. You're not going to worry about this icon or the number during the game. But in our Evade example, if we were between games and we were making our spell book, we'd look up here and you can see it has a spell level of 1, indicated by that small number 1, and it's from the War School. The War School symbol has that hammer. Not all cards will look like the one we've just shown. For instance, some cards will have attack bars that have specific attacks. Enchantments will have a hidden casting cost and then a reveal cost. So there are going to be some differences between the cards, but basically they will all have that similarity. So we'll cover those later specifically. In Mage Wars, you're going to be casting a heck of a lot of spells. It is a game of dueling mages after all. So you're going to need to know the specific steps of casting spells. Let's get into it. Remember, you can only cast spells that you plan during the planning phase. So let's just assume that you have your 2 spells that you've planned, and now it is your action phase. You want to cast a spell. So here are the official steps. Step 1, cast the spell. You verbally declare what spell you are casting. You say its name, but you also say what the target of the spell is. You have to make sure that the target of the spell is legal. So you look at the casting line and you make sure that the target on your spell card matches the type of target you are targeting. So you could target zones, objects, creatures, so make sure you're targeting the right thing. The target of a spell must be in range. All spells have a range given in zones. The range lists two numbers, such as 0-2. The first number is the minimum distance the caster can be from the target, and the second number is the maximum distance. For example, if a spell has a range of 0 to 2, the target can be 0, 1, or 2 zones away from a spellcaster. And the spellcaster is usually the mage. And when we say 0, we mean that the range is in the same zone as the spellcaster. If the target spell says 1 to 2, it can only target objects 1 or 2 zones away and cannot target objects in the same zone, range 0, or 3 or more zones away. Remember to count range orthogonally, never diagonally. If you don't know what orthogonally means, it's geek speak for up, down, left, and right. Remember, some objects like walls will block line of sight, which makes perfect sense because in real life, if I threw a wall in front of your face, you're not seeing beyond that wall, you're seeing a wall. But we'll talk about that later in a different video. Right now, let's talk about some spells that require additional choices. For instance, some spells like Dispel have a variable casting cost, indicated by an X on the spell. Then there's other spells that have multiple effects, from which you have to choose. You must declare which of those you are choosing when you cast the spell. Finally, you must pay all costs for this spell. Reduce the mana in your mana supply equal to the casting cost, or reduce the mana on your familiar or spawn points by removing the appropriate markers. You do that if you're using your familiar or your spawn point instead of your mage when you're casting a spell. But in our example, we're using the evade spell. So some spells have additional costs such as taking damage, lowering your life value, or destroying an object in play. These costs must also be paid now or the spell is canceled. You gotta pay what's due. So now that you've spent it, now you gotta show that you've spent it. So in the specific example of the evade spell, it has a mana cost of 3. So after you cast a spell and you're at this stage, reduce the mana in your mana supply equal to 3. So look at your status board, mana supply, reduce it by 3. As soon as you pay the cost required of your spell, the spell has been cast. There's no taking it back. But until you have paid the mana cost, you can still take back that move. Think of it like chess. When you move a chess piece and you let go of the chess piece, that is your move. No takesy backsies. In Mage Wars, it's the same thing when you pay the mana cost. Once you've paid the mana cost, the spell is in play and the effect happens. However, there's maybe an exception to the effect happening if your opponent counters it. Once the spell has been cast, go to step 2, counter spell. Your opponent now has a chance to counter the spell you just cast. Normally there is nothing your opponent can do and the spell simply takes effect. However, some spells and abilities, such as the Nullify enchantment, may allow them to counter your spell. When a spell is countered, it is discarded without effect and you lose the mana spent in any action used to cast the spell. After this is resolved, you then move on to the next step, resolving the spell. But let's look at the sleep spell and the nullify spell. Let's suppose someone is casting the sleep spell. They've already done all of their mana costs. They've reduced the mana in their mana pool on their status board, but then the opponent announces, I get to counter, and he flips over the nullify enchantment. Womp womp, the spell's been nullified. The person who just cast sleep loses that spell and that entire action. At this stage, the spell takes effect. The spell type and the text on the card determine what happens. For example, in the evade spell, that is when the target gains the elusive trait. The target is now elusive. So those are the steps to casting a spell. As you go through them over and over again, it will be second nature. You'll go through them very quickly and fluidly. In fact, just to show you how it will work once you are natural at the game, let's take a look at an example. Okay, so my Warlock is going to cast this Fireball on this Bitterwood Fox. I'm going to flip over my action marker first. The Fireball has a target of creature or conjuration. So the Bitterwood Fox, since it's a creature, is a legal target. The Fireball has a range of 0 to 2, so I count 1, 2 zones. The Bitterwood Fox is in range. The Fireball costs 8 mana, so I'll pay my 8 now. I'll ask my opponent now if they're countering it. We'll assume they say no. And so now my spell takes effect. If you take a look at the Fireball card, you'll see that it has an attack value of 6. The spell also has an effect, so I roll 6 attack dice and 1 d12. If you don't know what a d12 is, that's geek speak for a 12-sided die. As you can see here, I rolled 3 damage, and then I rolled a 9 on my effect die. If we check the effect box, we'll see that my effect die roll of 9 had 1 burn effect. So now I'll put damage markers on the Bitterwood Fox that indicate the 3 damage, and also 1 burn marker token on it. The last thing I do is discard this spell. Since the Fireball is an attack spell, it has an immediate effect on the game and then is discarded. I'll keep a discard pile next to the arena for just my cards so they don't get mixed up with my opponent's cards. And that's it. I just cast my Fireball spell. Pretty easy, huh? That's how you cast a spell in Mage Wars. But keep in mind, there's a whole bunch of different spell types. There's incantations, enchantments, conjurations, and they totally play differently. But that's the essence of Mage Wars. What kind of spell and combinations will you do? For instance, will you summon a whole bunch of creatures and just have a Zerg attack over at your opponent? Or will you just summon one creature and buff it? Forget the creatures, why not yourself? You can buff the mage up. You yourself can be one powerful creature. The choice is yours. So that's it for now. Join us next time when we talk about mages. I'm Alan Gerding, and I'll see you in the arena.